I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati.
Hello, guys. What's going on? Happy Tuesday, ladies and gentlemen. I want to give a couple shout outs to people in the chat. Shaheed will be here in just a second. What is going on? Smokey Sally says, yep, I did the same. I don't know what that means, but welcome. Greetings overnight. What's going on? Natalie, I hope you feel better. I saw this earlier. Welcome. I hope you feel better. Seriously. No one wants to be sick around the holidays. It's not good. What's going on? Hannah G says, let's do it. All right, let's do it. Shout out to the Red Precarian. How are you doing? Says, hola, compañeros. Greetings. And I think I am a little, I'm not fuzzy. Okay. Just double checking. What's going on? Inca 4484 says Pelosi corruption is revealed again 6 or 17 more times and someone is going to do something about it. I hope they do. Sincerely. What's going on? Ashura says AOC finger wagging amounts to shit. She's one of those do nothing Democrats. Oh, we're going to get into that tonight. What is going on, Jean? Jean says, Natalie, she's sorry and she hopes you get attended to quickly and you'll be okay. I do as well. Shout out to Eric, who's a Sabby member. Says, hi there, lefty friends. Greetings, Lawrence. Always a pleasure to see you. Lawrence says, doobie doo. What's going on, Malik? Great to see you here. Shout out to Valerie. Hello, fellow strugglers in this hellscape. Absolutely. I completely understand. What is going on? Shayar says, good evening to all Sabby misfits. Good evening to you as well. Greetings, Miguel. Peace. I love the piece from Miguel. He always does that. What's going on? Kim says, doobie doo, Sabby. What is up? Shout out to Leroy, who's a Sabby member, says, good day, comrades. Greetings, Christian Gomez says, first live stream in a while. Love you, Sabby. Welcome back, Christian. Welcome back. Shout out to Larry C. Mark says, hi, Sabby. Larry, is that your photo ID? Maybe. Or maybe that's someone else. I don't know. Greetings, Arturo says, hi. Jalette says, don't say anything anti-Semitic. You are on a hot mic. LMAO. Oh, boy. Oh, dear. Oh, dear. What's going on? Dan O'Neill says, MSN had a bit, said, every side is pissed at Joe. Bite me for his cannabis law ideas. Yes. Greetings, Yipper99. What is going on? Janice says, build back BS, totally predictable. Greetings, Sean M says, what's up? Neuropsych gives a big heart for all of you out there watching. What's going on? Mr. X says, hello, leftist. Shout out to Swanky Tia says, love the hair, Sabs. Thank you so much. I got a much needed haircut and I also had to redo my highlights. So I was supposed to do that 6 months ago. That's how behind I am. Greetings, Mark Profiter says, my goddess of information, doobie doo. Shout out to you too. All right, Shaheed is here, so I'm gonna go ahead and bring him in. Hi, Shaheed.
Great to be with you again, Sabby. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for coming. I've been waiting for this because I did a show about Nancy Pelosi. I think that was last week about the insider trading, which that comment that she made that she feels that politicians should be able to participate in it because it's a free market.
Right.
And then I got the information from you and I was like, oh boy, this goes deeper than I realized. So everyone, please welcome Shaheed. And for those of you just tuning in, welcome to Sabby Sabs podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. We're going to get into a couple of things tonight. It's been an interesting week for news, including that press conference that happened earlier today. Oh dear. This is what we're talking about tonight. AOC shames Rahm Emanuel. What is going on with Rahm Emanuel? What happened, and why should we all be concerned? Joe Biden tanks. A new poll came out this morning. I'm going to get into that. And first and foremost, I'm going to start with Nancy Pelosi corruption revealed. You see, it says there that I'm greedy. So let's go ahead and get into that. So Shaheed, I'm going to go with you first.
Appreciate that.
So Nancy Pelosi made a statement about a week ago that she felt like politicians should be able to engage in insider trading because we have a free market. It's a free market economy. I found that to be rather cringe. I felt like she said the quiet part out loud, so to speak. I don't know. But you sent over 2 press releases recently, and I want to go ahead and get into that. So for those who don't know, these are 2 different ones. I'm going to share my screen because the first one, come here.
As you're pulling that up, Sabby, if I may just note the hypocrisy of the statement at the outset. We'll get into various dimensions of why it's so bad. But the idea that members of Congress should be able to trade stock because it's a free market is just a preposterous misunderstanding of the facts, because there's nothing about the free market in which members of Congress are trading based on inside information that they have that the public does not. So even if we were to accept run amok capitalism, there's nothing about it implicated in what she is defending. And we can get into all the different ways in which this is a self-serving justification and the various ways in which she's been enriching herself and her family at the public's expense.
Absolutely. I'm going to share my screen. So this is the first one. See if I can make this a little bit larger. I don't think I can because I'm on Word, but I'll read it from here. Actually, I can. Yeah, I can. Okay, that's better. So this one is in reference to Shaheed points out conflicts of interest in infrastructure amid House Speaker San Francisco publicity tour. Now, this is in reference to SALT. So it says Shaheed Buttar calls for her to disclose her conflicts of interest within the bill, particularly from the SALT cap repeal. Our city's elected representative in Congress, it is critical that Nancy Pelosi reveal how much she is poised to personally benefit from the repeal of the cap on state and local tax deductions. She talks about the benefits to unions, which we support, but we need full disclosure on her personal interests to know whether this legislation will primarily benefit her constituents or instead of her class interests. Shaheed, you want to go ahead and talk about that?
Sure. So the SALT deduction is a deduction that high income tax filers, particularly in coastal states that have high state and local taxes, can claim from their federal income taxes. And what people are often claiming as deductions based on state and local taxes are things like property taxes. Landlords pay a lot in property taxes. And when the SALT tax cap was repealed, landlords, or if it is repealed, I should say, the bill that would do so has passed the House, but as we all know, it has died in the Senate. But if it does pass, people like Nancy Pelosi, particularly landlords in blue states, will be poised to benefit disproportionately. And this is not the first targeted tax break that she has engineered. Every tax break for the wealthy, and there have been many over the past decade during the time when the federal minimum wage has been frozen, every one of those tax breaks put money in her pocket. And it is striking to me that insider trading has been the limit of the conversation when the corruption runs so much deeper, right? The tax breaks that are targeted for the wealthy are one example. The construction of the Paycheck Protection Program is another. This is a program with limited funds that ran out before they reached many Black and brown communities. There was a story here in San Francisco that the San Francisco Chronicle published noting the failure of the PPP to reach all parts of the Bay Area. It was striking to me that that story did not mention that one of the beneficiaries of the Paycheck Protection Program is a business owned in part by Nancy Pelosi's husband. And these layers of self-dealing, of the prioritization, not just of a stock portfolio, but ultimately a dynastic fortune, both a political fortune and an economic one, it has gone completely unnoticed in the press. Now, when we talk about the BBB, the Build Back Better bill, and her conflicts of interest in it, the proposed repeal of the SALT cap, the cap that previously limited state and local tax deductions from federal income taxes. That's one example of how the BBB process was subverted. But there were others here too. The whole time that Pelosi's been in Washington, mouthing support for Biden's agenda, she's been working to kneecap it in the shadows. There were at least 3 different legislative deadlines that she set up as concessions to moderates, deadlines by which she wanted to see the infrastructure bill move first, as it ultimately did, despite Biden and the Progressive Caucus's commitment to try to move them together. So this is yet another example of the press reporting on the words of politicians instead of their records. And Pelosi, frankly, has escaped any accountability for having done everything that she can, frankly, to keep this bill from passing.
Is she a landlord?
Oh, yeah. She makes over $1 million a year in rental income. I mean, her net worth is $200 million. And that it's hard, I think, for people to understand the depth of corruption when you have the Democratic Party, that is the one that's supposed to be the antithesis, right? They construct themselves as for the people, but they're led by a mega millionaire who hasn't debated anyone in 34 years. And just to be clear, to amass a $200 million fortune based on her congressional salary would take 800 years. And she might have been around for a long time, but she's not that old. No one obviously is. And it kind of proves this point that, there's no way to make that kind of money without making it on someone else's back. And ultimately, the backs on who Nancy Pelosi has made her fortune are those of we, the people of the United States. And it is frankly unacceptable. We could pull a thread here about how this undermined the impeachment process, too, of the former president and the bipartisan nature of self-enrichment and emoluments clause violations in Washington. There are lots of places to take this conversation depending on, where you might want to.
How it undermined the impeachment process of Trump?
Yeah. So in the first instance, Pelosi didn't want to impeach him. She was dragged to it. And when she did finally show up, each of the impeachment processes conspicuously omitted any reference to self-enrichment. There's a clause in the Constitution, the emoluments clause, which constitutionally prohibits elected officials, anyone in government, from profiting at the public's expense, which is exactly what our former president did. It's exactly what Nancy Pelosi does. It's exactly what many officials across both of the corporate parties do in Washington. The reason I think she was not only unwilling, but ultimately unable to bring the charge that could have brought Trump down was because it was a bipartisan offense and she didn't want to get caught on the hook doing the same things that he is. Right. I mean, this idea of enriching oneself at public expense, we've talked about some of the examples, the pocketing PPP funds or the targeted tax breaks. The SALT cap repeal is yet another example of that, right? Each one of those steps, and not even to mention the insider trading and every discrete instance of it across the many stocks that she's traded, every one of those acts are effectively unconstitutional. No one's looked at them. And the only way anybody would look at them is if a corrupt president is trying to fend off accusations from the other party by noting that they're up to their necks in it too. And while I don't want to, recast history because it's a counterfactual at this point, but it was quite clear that the various charges in the impeachment processes were not going to get Republican support. If the hearings were all about the litany of ways in which a criminal president was putting taxpayer funds in his pocket, that is actually the sort of thing that might inspire some rage from a grassroots, even a right-wing base that might push senators to move. So I said from the beginning that that's the key to bringing him down. And again, it's exactly where she was at least unwilling to go, and I dare say unable to go, because as a figure complicit in the same set of offenses, we can't expect accountability from foxes guarding a henhouse, as it were.
Right? Yeah, very true. I want to get to the second part because this is in reference to the insider trading. And this was the piece I talked about last week, but I didn't go in depth. So this is important to know. Insider trading to enlarge her family's fortune is the tip of the iceberg. So it says here, in response to the Hill exposing the $5 million profit from Nancy Pelosi's family realized on stock trades days before a recent House antitrust subcommittee markup, Shaheed Buttar said Speaker Nancy Pelosi's record of putting her private portfolio but for the needs of the American people is sadly not new. She participated in the Visa IPO before scuttling proposed regulations of credit card companies. A wealthy landlord herself, Pelosi also blocked Ilhan Omar's 2020 proposal to cancel rent and mortgage payments during the pandemic from ever reaching the House floor. She has unfortunately consistently leveraged leveraged her public office to enrich herself and her wealthy family. Let's go ahead and get into that, Shaheed.
So the Ilhan's bill, the cancel rents and mortgages bill, was sort of the hook there. And this is, we noted a few minutes ago how Nancy Pelosi's status and wealth as a landlord might carry with it certain financial and economic interests, which are nowhere disclosed when she, as the Speaker of the House, is blocking the House from voting on or even considering at any point. I don't even think the bill was ever the subject of a markup in a committee. The proposal that would have forced banks to pay the cost of mortgages and rents during the pandemic. This isn't a very sharp distinction, but just to look at this from another angle, with Omicron spreading around the world, a lot of people are concerned about public health policy. Then one of the number one things we could do is stop placing public health at odds with the tension people feel to feed their families. And so taking the burden to pay for housing costs off of struggling workers at a time like this and letting banks pay those costs would make perfect sense. It's not just a worker and working family supporting policy. It's a public health supporting policy in the middle of a pandemic that no one has heard about because a wealthy landlord could lose money if that policy becomes law. And that wealthy landlord is the leader of the Democratic Party, right? I mean, and this is, again, just like one example among many. And this is an impact that is dramatic for we the people of the United States. I mean, we know, for instance, that at a minimum wage salary, even working 40 hours a week, there's not a single place in this country where someone can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And I wonder how different that might be if Democrats weren't led by a wealthy landlord mega millionaire who ducks debates while pocketing scarce government funds, insider trading. You know, this pattern is worse than the sum of its parts. And I'm grateful that people seized on the insider trading again. It's like a part of a puzzle and it's problematic. But when you zoom out from the part of the puzzle and you look at the entirety, I mean, it's even worse than we've talked about now, right? If we talk about the corruption and the figure of the speaker, I have a heart, especially when we talk about Ilhan Omar as someone who she's, contending and blocking her proposal from reaching the floor. Another thing that Ilhan Omar proposed is that we should accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, which is not a no-brainer. I mean, we did fight the World War that led to it being established, but we won't consent to its jurisdiction because we know that the entire senior leadership of the CIA would end up in The Hague. And so might Nancy Pelosi, because she was one of the figures briefed in and read into the CIA's what they called enhanced interrogation techniques. So when Nancy Pelosi is condemning Ilhan Omar for being anti-Semitic, since she, for the glaring offense of saying that we should, as a country, should support human rights instead of undermining them, to what extent is her attack on Ilhan Omar not only disingenuous, but also self-serving? When you're talking about wealthy people trying to keep themselves out of prison by punching down at refugees in Congress, that's a problem that is well beyond the figures, right? Human rights are implicated here. Frankly, our nation is implicated here. We, the people of the United States, are implicated here. But too rarely do the conflicts of interest get observed. And beyond the conflicts of interest looms an even greater problem, and that is the outright corruption of Congress and its structural, institutional inability to perform its constitutional function.
I kind of see Nancy Pelosi as a player in the game. I put the responsibility on the banks because if I were to pull up a chart, I had a chart about a couple weeks ago. I don't know what I did with it. My apologies. But if I were to show that chart again, it shows like the class structure throughout the world. And that chart shows that the banks are actually above the politicians. So to me, like, I would actually put the blame on them. And when you look back at the 2008 housing crisis, now it makes sense why Obama bailed out the banks instead of bailing out the American people. I feel like they're the ones that are really calling the shots. I feel like it's JP Morgan, it's BlackRock, it's Vanguard, it's a lot of these institutions that are not spoken of, and I feel like people need to talk about it more and make more people aware. Oh, thank you, Eric. You found it. Thank you, because I lost it.
Uh-huh.
This was the chart that I was talking about, and it compares medieval feudalism to corporate feudalism.
Yeah.
And you can see like not much has really changed. And so the elected officials, they're kind of towards the center, and the corporate elite, which includes the Fortune 500 companies, they're above the elected officials.
Yeah, that's the only place I'd quibble with the chart. Like I certainly believe that medieval feudalism has parallels to corporate feudalism, and most of these I think line up. I mean, I think of the vassals, top professionals, I think are more aligned with the, I'd almost like slide everything on the corporate feudalism up a notch, because the vassals are we who work for a living. Top professionals, are not necessarily in that category, right? So they're relatively privileged. Anyway, I'm chasing a rabbit. The point here I'd make is that you're absolutely right that the banks call the shots. Another way to put this is that we live under capitalism, not democracy. People think of capitalism as free markets. Capitalism is when our public policy is dictated by capital, not by people. And that is the world that we live in. There's even been empirical studies that have established this. A Princeton study circa 2007, 2008. I can't remember the authors' names, unfortunately, but they established that as a matter of empirical history, the bills that have passed Congress are not necessarily the ones with popular support. They're the ones that are favored by Wall Street. Any industrial complex can move things through Congress in ways that people can't. Another way I like to describe this is that there's a lot of discourse, particularly among the left, about the dangers of corporate personhood. It's too charitable, because corporations, not only are they not people, but they're granted the legal status of people. They are hyper people. They never die. They're disembodied. They can conscript legions of people into serving them. So corporate personhood is, frankly, a very charitable way to describe the hyper citizenship that corporations have grown to embody. And then when you aggregate that influence across enterprises within an industry, that, put simply, is why we don't have universal healthcare in this country. That's why we have a military industrial complex. When Eisenhower describes a military, the industrial complex part of it is Wall Street. And we have industrial complexes that govern everything from foreign policy and war to pharmaceuticals and health insurance. The fossil fuel industrial complex comes to mind here. Any industrial complex has more influence in Washington than we, the people of the United States, do. And that's a reflection that our commitment to democracy, even by the so-called Democratic Party, is as thin as a piece of paper. And maybe another piece I'd throw in the mix here is that it's not just the corruption of the political process. The policy process is infected as a result. And now, in an age of climate catastrophe, we can see the result at scale, right? Because we have for so long shut people out of the political process and allowed corporations to call the shots, they have together contrived a global calamity that now threatens all of us. And this race to democratize the country is no longer just a struggle for democracy. This is literally a struggle for the viability of our species on this planet, ultimately. And there's no way around liberating these institutions from the control of capital. I keep coming up with one other thing to say, and I'm sorry to keep doing this, but another piece, just thinking about that chart, the relationship between bankers and banks and the corporate politicians that enable them and that they support. I don't think it's necessarily fair to rank them insofar as, for instance, nobody at Goldman Sachs can do what Nancy Pelosi does. The Speaker of the House has unique authorities to block bills, for instance, from reaching the House floor, or to fast track legislation. So while the banks might be lurking in the shadows, it ultimately requires the complicity of these very pivotally situated figures who have been willing, not just her, but across the corporate Democratic Party. Manchin comes to mind, Sinema comes to mind, any number of others, Schumer. They put their careers before the public interest. And that's why industrial complexes have so much influence.
Yeah, I think the thing with the way I kind of see it is that let's say that Nancy Pelosi, one of her donors is Goldman Sachs. I don't know if it is or not, but it actually wouldn't surprise me if it was.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Then it's like, because that's one of her donors, she's going to answer to them instead of the American people, because she wants them to continue to be a donor. It's just this is why I tell people you have to get the money out. because as long as you have the money, that is what is running the government. That is what is running the country. Like, you have to get the money out. And I think that a lot of politicians in office in DC know that, but I don't think they really either know what to really do about it, or they don't want to do anything about it because they're comfortable. They like their lifestyle. They want to have a career as a politician. So I think that when you get used to having those types of perks in life, like they only need 5 years and then they can get speaking fees and they can write a book and they get a pension. So I think they get used to that type of lifestyle.
I don't disagree, though I would push back a little bit on the idea that they don't realize that money in politics is infecting the process, only because in 2003, this was a while ago now, but Congress passed a law. People know it as the McCain-Feingold. It was the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2003. My very first case as a baby lawyer was defending it from the Federal Election Commission, and we won our case before the DC Circuit. My clients were 2 members of Congress. Chris Shays and Marty Meehan were the bipartisan co-sponsors in the House of the McCain-Feingold bill, which tried to protect the political process by limiting the influence of corporate soft money. And we won our case in the DC Circuit in 2006. 4 years later, the Supreme Court in the Citizens United decision flipped it all upside down, destroyed that era of my work. And the very next election cycle, Russ Feingold, the progressive Wisconsin senator who helped write that law and bring it into being, his Senate seat was bought for $10 million in an illegal campaign financial fraud scam by a right-wing Senator, Ron Johnson, who continues to this day to sit in that seat, waging a class war on we the people of the United States and his constituents. And so this process here, I would say, as much as I think it's fair to critique members of Congress for their privilege, I think at least a generation ago, they did try to take action here. And the Supreme Court, the right-wing Supreme Court, before the additions of Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Barrett, blocked them from doing it. So this is a complicated picture here where I'm the first person to say that congressional corruption is the heart of the problem. It's why I'm running for Congress. And I just recognize that the court has an independent role here in also, unfortunately, accelerating the race to the bottom in ethics, even over the objections of members of Congress who tried in one era to defend politics from Wall Street.
Shadow Ban Refugee said Pelosi does absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. Start taking on the entire superstructure of DC and the American empire, not just a figurehead on Xanax. Yeah, the system is the problem. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed. I want to show something here. Someone sent me this video earlier today. I had never seen this before. It's not about Nancy Pelosi. It's about Joe Manchin. But similar issue here. So I want to play this video. I was not aware of Joe Manchin's finances. And I don't know if you guys have seen this. This is going around on Twitter. And I saw this earlier and I was like, you have got to be kidding me. But this will explain a lot to people why he does what he does and who he does it to. So I'm just going to share my screen for a second.
What was your salary last year?
About $18 million.
It pays to be a member of Joe Manchin's family.
Follow the money.
Joe Manchin has represented West Virginia for 40 years. Delegate, state senator, secretary of state, governor, U.S. senator. 40 years, and West Virginia is still the second poorest state in the country. Economy. West Virginia ranks 48 out of 50 states.
Thank you, Joe Manchin.
Healthcare. 47 out of 50 states.
Thank you, Joe Manchin.
Education, 45 out of 50 states.
Thank you, Joe Manchin.
Infrastructure, wait for it, 50 out of 50 states. Manchin has an estimated net worth of $8 million,
Follow the money.
while the average annual income of West Virginia is just $26,000. Manchin receives a taxpayer-paid salary as a U.S. Senator of $184,500. So he didn't get his $8 million there.
Nice yacht, Joe.
So where does all the money come from? Manchin receives $491,000 annually from his son's coal brokerage company, EnerSystems. His wife, Gail Manchin, received $613,000 from EnerSystems. That's $1.1 million to Manchin and his wife from his family's energy company. Manchin makes 5 times more from his family's energy company than he does as a U.S. senator. Joe Manchin has blocked President Biden's infrastructure plan from moving forward because he wants to kill legislation to replace coal-fired plants with clean energy. Manchin is selling out his own country to protect big coal and big oil who own him.
Joe Manchin, I talk to his office every week. He is the kingmaker, and he's not shy about sort of staking his claim early.
The chairman of the committee that regulates coal shouldn't be a part owner of a coal company.
This is Heather Manchin, Joe Manchin's daughter. After lying about having an MBA, she was named CEO of Mylan Industries. She artificially jacked up the price of EpiPens by 461% and was awarded with a 671% salary increase. West Virginia is poor, poorly educated, and broken, but Joe Manchin and his entire family have become multimillionaires.
West Virginia, abused and suckered for 40 years by Joe Manchin.
That is real.
It's like, so when I tell you guys to follow the money, does it all make sense now? Like, he's in like the poorest, I think West Virginia is the second poorest state in the country. Everybody else is poor. And he has all this money. What has he been doing all this time he's been in office? So and people continue to vote for him.
He had a challenger in the last cycle who Democrats refused to coalesce behind and ultimately helped kneecap. So when you see Democrats try to claim that Manchin is the problem, remember, they put him there. He is the creation of the Democratic Party. And so they want to disown him now, but he's absolutely there. Not only is he their creation, but there is this dynamic. People are familiar with the concept of a rotating villain. Mm-hmm. So he's just the scapegoat at the moment. And he's playing exactly the same role that Pelosi has played on healthcare. He's playing exactly this, right? Because she is a healthcare investor too. If you invest in Wall Street and you put corporate interests before those of the American people, there's no difference across these different instances. It's just which wealthy congressperson is making which industry money at the expense of the rest of us. And the one thing that made me chuckle about that ad is that he's making $1 million a year and he's only worth $8 million. Pelosi's worth over 20 times that. And I only say that because, again, in the rotating villain construction, he's far from the worst. He's the worst at the moment because he's the one in the spotlight. But he is unfortunately part of a tribe, and it is a tribe that we need to remove. And with respect to the comment that came on right before you played the clip, I absolutely agree that the system is the problem, but the nature of systems is you can't take it down in one step. You have to take it apart piece by piece. There is no path to removing the system without removing individual office holders who construct it. It's why I'm running for Congress, right? And I see a lot of kind of confusion in the body politic now, especially among leftists who don't quite understand the political moment or the opportunity we have to take a cultural consensus that favors human rights and bake it into policy by forcing that agenda through the political system. A lot of people internalize from Bernie's experience that there's no hope in politics, as if the presidency were the only office at stake. But there are literally thousands of offices in this country, every one of which constructs a system, every one of which is contestable. And when we throw our hands up in the air and defer to a system, we frankly do its work for us, because it is ultimately deferential to a system to treat it like a system instead of a construction of parts that we can disassemble and replace. That's the opportunity that democracy affords us. And while it might be suffering from 1,000 cuts, we still have at least a vestige of it. And that's why I'm here, because I'm eager through whatever vestige of democratic control we retain over capital in our policy process to do what we can to put human rights first.
But how do we dismantle different pieces when the Democratic establishment always works against us? Like, for example, with the squad, it is just whatever Nancy Pelosi tells them to do, they do. So even if they don't vote the way that they say they're going to vote, because Nancy Pelosi whispers in like one of their ears, like on video, and then so how do we?
This is why I'm running against her, because she's not just a member of Congress. She is a crucial one. She is frankly the crucial one, because as a mega millionaire who leads the Democratic Party, it doesn't matter how many other seats we flip. We could flip a bunch of other seats, and it frankly wouldn't matter. As long as she is in Congress, the two-party system and its complicity around Wall Street will continue. A lot of people blame the Democratic Party for things to which it is certainly institutionally committed, but commitments that are driven by individual actors. And they throw their hands up in the air as if, oh, this feature of the Democratic Party is intrinsic. It's not intrinsic at all. FDR put a chicken in every pot because he fought and gained control of the party, right? And granted, there were lots of things about that era that might have been not everything we hoped in retrospect, but it was a pretty transformative time. The creation of Social Security, right? The creation of at least the meager bulwarks that we have to protect people from the vagaries of the market. A lot of them were constructed then. And it's because change is in fact possible through politics when we don't all defect from a process out of disillusion. I'm also struck that a lot of the people who perceive electoral politics as being hopeless might be relatively new to a struggle that many of us have been a part of for a long time. And at the moment, there are policies being debated in Congress that we never were able to get there before. And it's precisely because of the squad. So I see a lot of sort of knee-jerk assignments of accountability that fail to recognize the landscape. You're absolutely right that the squad bows to Nancy Pelosi. And I wish they would be more willing to challenge her. I could give them a particular opportunity to do that. If they felt so concerned about her coming after them, they might endorse her challenger. That to this point hasn't happened. So I recognize their unwillingness / timidity / intimidation by the figure of the speaker and the corrupt corporate establishment that she represents. I also recognize, though, that we who observe the system, none of us have the luxury of deferring to these people, whether it's Pelosi or the squad. In other words, when I hear people critique the squad, my first reaction is, well, then do something about it. And defecting from a process literally does nothing about it. It, in fact, abdicates the system to go only worse. And so I see the reaction to the stimulus almost making the stimulus work. It's like responding to an illness by, drinking not medicine, but more of whatever the poison is. And that's what electoral nihilism represents. If we defer to the system, this process will grow only worse. You're absolutely right that the squad has not been nearly as, it's so many things to say here. The squad is not the squad. Ilhan and Corey stand up and they take heat in ways that many of the rest of them don't. So to lump in everyone in the squad with the others does a disservice to those who have taken heat for taking stalwart positions, and it's charitable to those who have not. And it puts a lot on the shoulders of a handful of people in Congress who ultimately don't have the numbers to do much. They do have the numbers to operate at the margins, but they don't vote as a bloc. So it's a little bit, again, it's charitable to those who lack the willingness to show up, and it's unfair to those who do, to lump them in as a group. And it's even more unfair to lump them in with the entire kit and caboodle of electoral politics and think of the whole thing as corrupt because we haven't yet to this point managed as a movement to compel the establishment to put our interests first. It's not the people in the middle that are the way. I'd remind people of that, the graphic that you showed. If people are frustrated at the squad, look up the chain. It's ultimately the banks calling the shot. It's the corporate leaderships of the parties that are suppressing those voices. And I see a lot of people throwing out babies with proverbial bathwater. And that's as much of a threat to the future, frankly, as fascism. The abdication of people who see the corruption of a process, but marginalize themselves by removing themselves from it.
Well, I got to push back a little bit on the FDR thing because FDR's New Deal policies didn't help Black people, though.
I agree with
Like
that.
I actually did. I did a whole show about that with Marcus.
Totally right.
I just wanted to make that clear. Like they benefited some people, but not all of us. I think, in reference to the squad, I think the big thing is that they were supposed to be a hostile takeover of the Democratic Party. So when you run on that kind of message, people expect to see, we expect to see that, right? Now, I don't know, like the pressure that they're going through. I'm not physically there. I can imagine it's probably a lot. But one of the
no
things
worse than
that,
Manchin. So it's what no worse than Manchin. So whatever pressure they're getting is much less than Manchin's getting. So I think it's unfair to blame, to give them credit for pressure being the thing that pushes them. But I'm with you.
Yeah. So I feel like in reference to their voice, I think the squad should continue to go on independent media. That's something they stopped doing after they won, because the independent media outlets are we want to hear what they have to say. Like, we're not CNN or MSNBC, and we're not going to frame a narrative in this way that works for the people who own the network. Nobody owns the show. So it's just that I think that was a mistake. I think they should have continued to do that. When they stopped doing that again, I don't know if that's coming from above. It could be. Maybe they're told, no, don't only go on certain ones. But it was those independent media platforms that introduced them to me in the first place. Had it not been for me seeing AOC on Jimmy Dore's show, I probably wouldn't have heard about her until she won.
Right.
So you can't forget the people who canvassed for you, the people who gave you that start, the people who really gave you the attention that mainstream media at that time was not giving them. You can't forget about those people. I think that that's incredibly important for them to continue to do.
Absolutely. And I'd focus on where you closed there rather than where you started out. It seems to me that it's much more about people forgetting where they came from than it is about the top whispering down here. And frankly, if they were, this is part of the ways in which I think we've all been disappointed by our movement's foot's in the door in Washington. I do, though, again, just want to make a sharp distinction here between Ilhan, Corey, and the rest of them. Ilhan and Corey staged hostile Democratic takeovers. Many of the rest of them didn't. I mean, AOC beat an entrenched incumbent, but I don't think anybody, well, and maybe some people thought of it as a hostile takeover of the party. It's been clear, I think, to many of us that it will take new voices for that sensibility to find fruition. And just to go back where I started a minute ago, it doesn't matter how many new voices we get as long as Nancy Pelosi's is still there. Now, another aspect of the Manchin ad that you showed that I think is relevant here is it was a lot of references in that video to Manchin's family, his son and the energy company that fills his pocket, that fills his wife's pocket, the way he has helped steer profits into his daughter's company by blocking proposals that would make medicine more affordable for working class people. There's a particular dimension of familial corruption and nepotism that also emerges in the race that I'm in. So a lot of people have asked Nancy Pelosi if she's ever going to retire. And she has consistently pushed back on the suggestion. 3 different news outlets now, Politico, CNN, and the LA Times have all reported that if she does eventually at some point decide to retire, and I could play out the tape here, I have a sense of how this might go. If she does choose to retire at some point, they're going to run her daughter, Christine, in her wake. Now, it's bad enough when you have wealthy people blocking federal legislation while filling their pockets for 30 years and ducking debates. When those people then want to start handing out congressional seats as if they're mansions as part of their, and she has plenty of mansions, right? She's a wealthy landlord with $1 million a year in rental income. It's one thing to bequeath a mansion to your kid. That might be, I actually don't think I have a whole proposal about inheritance law that I'd like to change. So, that's a piece of the puzzle too, but there's no theory of either capitalism or democracy that would encompass or permit or justify handing out seats in Congress as if they were parts of a private fortune to be handed out to one's kids. And that is not just nepotism. That is an attack on democracy. I'm talking about outright feudal aristocracy in a city that claims to be among the most progressive in the United States. And, I raise this only because I think whatever outrage the Manchin ad might have sparked in people seeing this dimension of sort of wealth and privilege hoarded, the same dynamic is true here. In fact, only much more so. And to locate how different it is, if West Virginia scores in all those different comparative indices, how it's got, some of the poorest infrastructure and some of the greatest education challenges, California is the most populous and prosperous state in the country. Our particular city, San Francisco, with a population under 1 million people, has sent to Washington the Vice President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, a senior U.S. Senator, and we sent to Sacramento the Governor of California. This is a freakishly powerful place that is insulated by layers upon layers of corruption. And that's just the corruption among the politicians. I haven't even gotten to the corruption in the press yet that insulates them. The entire Democratic establishment here is rotten top to bottom. And it's not just the figure of the speaker, and it's not just the family of the speaker. It's not just the entire corporate party or the system that they're a part of. It's all of it. And again, I want to come back to this need to disassemble the parts. We can't take a system apart at once. To take a system apart, you have to take apart the pieces. And she is a crucial, crucial piece. And even if she, the figure Nancy, is removed, to just insert Christine, Pelosi, another oligarch in the same place, will ensure that the same problems continue. And that's ultimately why I'm running for Congress, because I'm not content to merely criticize. It's not enough to critique at a time like this. Critique is satisfying. It's important. It's a crucial part of the puzzle, especially with so many sycophants surrounding the corrupt careerists. But at the end of the day, we have to assert, build, and displace power. There is no alternative. Power concedes nothing without a demand. Critique is not a demand. And so to all the people who are sort of defecting from a process that they critique, I would just invite them to deepen their struggle and do more. It's not enough to watch and wring your hands in disgust and walk away. That is an act of profound cowardice and ultimately complicity, because it does nothing for the future that stands at increasing risk at the predation of a present run amok.
Well, this is why I felt like the squad should have forced the vote, though.
I agree.
And put they voted for her. They kept her right where she is. So
But
it's just,
to be fair, even that was deferential. Like, they could have done a lot more than that. We could have knocked Pelosi out of Congress last year, and we still can. And I think everybody who can limits themselves to trying to fight for the speakership or to fight for a particular bill, it all seems very timid to me and deferential to this figure who, as we've discussed, is an embodiment of the corruption that's part of the problem.
Danielle said, would Shaheed run third party?
Thought about it a lot. The reason I haven't yet, and just to be clear, I was a Green for 15 years. So I'm no Democrat. I re-registered as a Democrat to run for office in a one-party city. There's no path to winning a citywide race in San Francisco unless you're a Democrat at the moment. Two things might change that. One is if we can expose the corruption of the Democratic Party and destroy it, which I'm very eager to do. The other is if a third party emerges that can build some momentum, which has also not yet happened. There's a scenario under which we alluded before to, if Pelosi does retire and they try to run her daughter in her wake. I expect under that scenario that a bunch of establishment Democrats might jump in the race. And if the mayor and a former state senator and a current state senator and more members of the boards of supervisors, if they all get in the race, that actually will liberate me to disaffiliate from the party, because they'll all be carving up the Democratic Party base. Without a bunch of other people in the race doing it, for me to affiliate with the Greens or the People's Party or Working Families would effectively neutralize my own threat. The reason in the last election cycle in 2020, I wasn't able to win the seat, but we won 6 different policies that the House of Representatives ultimately adopted that Pelosi opposed until we held her accountable and dragged her on issues like the Protecting Right to Organize Act or the Justice and Policing Act. Those threats to drag her on policy, I would take that off the table if I ran as a third party candidate, because it would reduce me basically to being an expression as opposed to an actual threat to be contended with. Put another way, I'm not just here for politics. I'm here for policy. And frankly, I don't even care about politics. I only care about policy. And that's why I see last year as having been so, frankly, successful beyond my wildest dreams. As an immigrant with no property, to have helped drag the Speaker of the House on 6 major issues, that's beyond my wildest dreams. I could never have imagined doing something like that. And I'm eager to do more of that. But I can't do that under a third-party banner unless a party attains some support. And to this point, none of them have. So I'm eager to see third parties emerge. I will continue to advocate for their interests. It's one reason why I've been critical of H.R. 1, despite its useful components on voting rights. It's a lot here to talk about the structure of elections. People increasingly, I think there's an awareness of ranked choice voting and public finance as alternatives to the way we count votes. I'd ultimately like to see us get to a proportional representation system where maybe parties that enjoy 15% support in a state might get 15% of the representation. We'd have a very different political system if we had points for second place, but we don't accept points for second place in the United States. It's winner take all. And as a structural matter that forces the political system to coalesce between two parties. It's one reason why I see it as so crucial to knock Nancy Pelosi out of office, because until we change the election process, or until a third party emerges, there is no other alternative. There's no way to reach climate justice or universal health care. There's no way to stop the next war unless we change the leadership of the Democratic Party. We can flip all the seats below it, won't matter. We could build a third party, and until it gets big enough to displace Democrats, it won't matter. From where I'm standing, the most crucial part of the system is the voice of the most progressive city in the country, which, as we've described, is not only conservative, but also indefensibly corrupt. And that's the part of the problem I'm closest to as a constituent with no office. This is a point to make clear too. I don't have an office. I'm not in Congress. I have no authority at all. I'm just a guy with a 20-year history of getting it right, fighting an oligarch. And I'm doing everything I can. And I really hope that everybody else finds a way to do everything that they can too.
All right. And that brings me into our second story, which is Rahm Emanuel.
Oh, God.
This guy is the worst. He is the worst. So for those who have not heard, Rahm Emanuel is confirmed as ambassador to Japan, despite Democrats' divide in the Senate. Rahm Emanuel, one of President Biden's most controversial nominees, won confirmation as ambassador to Japan on Saturday with a little help from the GOP. 8 moderate Republican senators voted in favor of the former Chicago mayor in a 48-21 roll call vote during a marathon session that saw the confirmation of more than 50 other ambassadors, judges, administration officials as legislators trickled out of town for the holidays. But 3 left-wing Democrats, Elizabeth Warren, sorry, it threw me there to see Elizabeth Warren as
left-wing.
Exactly. I was like, wait, what?
Right.
Elizabeth Warren, Ed Markey, and Jeff Merkley of Oregon opposed Emanuel due to his record on police brutality. For those who don't know, I'm going to get into that for a second. In 2014, Mayor Emanuel refused to release damning dashboard camera footage of a Chicago police officer shooting a 17-year-old Laquan McDonald in a case that helped give rise to the Black Lives Matter movement. We don't hear enough about this case, you guys. Like, people talk about BLM and we talk about like George Floyd and I forget his name, but the young gentleman who, Michael Brown, we reference it back. Yeah, we reference it back to like Ferguson, right? But there was also this incident that happened in Chicago. And so progressives rallied against Emanuel's August nomination. The nomination is deeply shameful. That came from AOC. As mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel helped cover up the murder of Laquan McDonald. So I'm going to go ahead and come out here. Shaheed, I want to get your take on this.
Yeah. As much as the criticism of Emanuel is well-deserved, it's frankly too kind because he's worse than even that. So this is a figure who, before he became the mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel played a crucial role in the Obama administration. It was Rahm Emanuel who dragged Obama to the right on everything from policing to civil liberties. He didn't just cover up the murder of Laquan McDonald. He also helped squander the last attempt within a Democratic presidency to do anything to restrain policing abuses. I'll tell a story here that goes back to the very beginning of the Obama administration. So one of the first things that Obama did when he came into office, his day one orders included changing the presumptions for government agencies responding to Freedom of Information Act requests. He ended CIA torture, and he said he was going to close Guantanamo. The very first thing that happened in Congress after this new president came in with the nation behind his back was congressional Democrats, Rahm Emanuel in the mix, selling him out, passing a bill with Republicans that blocked the State Department from resettling within the United States any Guantanamo detainees who were cleared through a judicial process for release. And that basically forced the facility to remain open, as it does to this day. And Rahm Emanuel, after doing that, ended up pushing out the White House counsel. This was Greg Craig, and then ended up coming in himself as the chief of staff later. So they not only blocked the closure of Guantanamo, they then forced key staff changes in the White House. And when Rahm came in, that was the point at which sort of the wheels came off and Obama went from sort of like center left to center right. That we could give Rahm Emanuel some credit for the drone strikes with impunity. We could give him some credit for the decision to do nothing after the Ferguson uprising, except to Obama made this executive decision to stop, I'm trying to remember, get this right, It was an order that attempted to limit police militarization, but it was completely meaningless. It was, if I remember correctly, the order forbid the Defense Department from selling treaded armored vehicles to cities. So you can't have an actual tank. So instead, they just gave MRAPs, mine-resistant armor-plated vehicles, which are basically tanks on wheels. So, and that was the extent of the Obama administration's attempts here, right? And this was the point at which police body cameras became ensconced as a supposed accountability mechanism. And we know those are just more surveillance devices to put more people in prison. You know, Rahm Emanuel did a lot more than cover up just the murder of one young man in Chicago. And the Chicago Police Department, we should just be clear here, is a piece of work. This is a police department. I used to live in Chicago in the 90s, and I was mugged by a gang of Chicago police in 1996 with both of my housemates a few blocks from my house. But before that, the Chicago Police Department, there was a commander by the name of John Burge who tortured hundreds of black men into false confessions using techniques that he learned when he was in Vietnam. So you've got Vietnam War vets bringing back Viet Cong torture techniques to apply to random people that they pick up on the south side of Chicago to then fill the city's prisons. That's the kind of corruption that Rahm Emanuel was insulating. That's the kind of corruption that any major city mayor who aligns with a police department is insulating. I want to make this really sharp. I live in San Francisco. This week, or it might have been last week, our city's mayor, London Breed, came out with this whole tough on crime vision that is just an absolute throwback to an era that we, the people of the United States, have long moved beyond. This idea of a carceral justice system that is built on retribution, that does not pay attention to patterns and practices of bias. It's exactly what we think we all transcended and are trying to move beyond. This is what many mayors around the country, Rahm Emanuel was one of them, London Breed is one of them now, who are trying to drag us back into the past as we're trying to seek new ways of helping people atone for their mistakes, as we're looking to try to build new ways of restorative justice, as we're trying to find new ways of supporting our communities instead of criminalizing people for crimes of particularly poverty. London Breed, like Rahm Emanuel, were agents of a carceral state. I haven't even gotten to Kamala Harris here, and that's a whole other thread we can pull on. But like, this is the MO of politicians at the moment, and Rahm Emanuel stands, frankly, to the right of his generation. He's not, at least with someone like London Breed or maybe Kamala Harris, you could say that they were right in line with other people around them at the time. I don't think of that as a sufficient excuse for any of them. But Rahm Emanuel, he was not even that. He was to the right of other Democrats, and he remains there. And for him to have an ambassadorship representing this country abroad after the human rights record that he's had, I actually think of it as painfully on brand for a country with a wide-ranging commitment to human rights abuses. We practice extended solitary confinement across our prison system. That's an international human rights violation. Just last year, ICE was caught forcibly sterilizing undocumented migrant women. That's a human rights violation. We are up to our necks in human rights violations. When the CIA was torturing people, no one was held accountable, right? I mean, this is our country. We are a human rights abusing country, and we are apparently proud of it. And it should make every American ashamed. It is absolutely shameful.
Wow. I want to go to some of the super chats, and I want to show you guys something else about Rahm Emanuel that a lot of people may not know about. Thanks so much, Steve. As I recall, Pelosi refused to debate Shaheed. Yes, because didn't she hasn't debated since like the 80s, right?
She has never once debated a challenger in the 34 years that she has served in Congress, filling her pockets and those of her family. I think it's insane that anybody thinks that that's okay. And I think it's preposterous that the press accepts it. It's not just, this again is a reflection, not just of Pelosi's corruption, but the Democratic Party's corruption and the failure institutionally across the board of journalists. In a country with a free press, for a politician to go 34 years without debating, to climb to the top of a political party, repeatedly fill their pockets, and still get away without debating anybody, it's just farcical, honestly. I mean, so when I see people say like, oh, democracy's hopeless, I get it. Trust me, I know. I don't know anyone in the country who has run more frontally into its illegitimacy. And all I'm saying is it doesn't frankly matter how stacked the deck is against us. We don't have, in 2021 with the climate crisis at hand, we don't have a choice but to play this game. And I recognize that it is rigged. And so many people who recognize that it is rigged are running from it. And it does leave those of us who are still playing the game basically at the mercy of the institutions, because the only way we win these struggles is when we lean in, when we treat fear as the problem, as the mind killer, when we recognize that fear is the problem and we engage the system that we are fearful of rather than defer to it and let it steamroll us. That is the only way out of this. Any number of moments in our past demonstrate that, from the abolition of slavery, gaining women's suffrage. Every war that we've managed to end came because people refused to defer. And I do think that this is a moment, whether it's in the context of ambassadors who are police violence supporting mayors, or whether it's in the context of speakers of the House who are wealthy landlords pursuing their class interests. We cannot afford to defer to these corrupt systems.
Thanks, Steve, for the super chat. Dude keeps saying, take it apart slowly. Show me in history where this happens, please. It's a statement of faith, not fact. Thanks so much for the super chat, Steve. And Kyle, dump the Dems. Power concedes nothing without a demand. Fred Douglas. And Roger Meadows, thanks so much for the super chat. Hate supporting YouTube as they censor, but must send here. But feel free to read after the interview what I sent yesterday, but ask him what I sent on Rockfin today. Okay, thank you so much, Roger Meadows, as well. I want to show you guys something else about Rahm Emanuel. I honestly don't know how anyone, especially Barack Obama, should be ashamed of supporting him. I don't know how I got here. What happened? Oh, hold on, you guys.
Pop-up ad from the Sun-Times, it looked like.
Yeah, I know. I was like, what was that? So Rahm Emanuel, Chicagoans most likely will remember from his tenure is that he closed 50 schools.
Right, that too.
50 schools. And it got me again here, but it said the majority of them were in African-American neighborhoods.
Teachers mobilized against him. He was one of the people who helped inspire the wave of teacher mobilizations across the country.
And this is the person that they confirmed, like, as the ambassador. It's embarrassing.
There's a layer to this actually that's really gross, and I hadn't even thought about this before, but follow me here. Japan was the target of the only use of weapons of mass destruction against a civilian population in the history of humankind, and it was our country that did that. And so to send a human rights abusing mayor as an ambassador to a country that we have assaulted with nuclear weapons is, I don't often fail for words, but I can't even capture how dark that is and how disturbing that is and how devious that is across time. Either one of those things is bad enough. You put the two together. I often found myself astounded at how deep is the corruption that we confront as a people. But again, I think it's painfully on brand for a country that is as committed, which is to say is not committed at all in any way to human rights as we are. It's especially shameful for a country that fought a world war to establish human rights in the first place. I mean, this is a piece I don't think a lot of people understand just how profound was the shift in the world over the last 70 years in the wake of the Second World War, when we went from establishing the UN, the International Criminal Court, the Bretton Woods institutions, to then the Pax Americana corporate resource CIA extraction machine that has unfolded in the years since. It is a threat not only to human rights, but democracy around the world. Rahm Emanuel's appointment as an ambassador to Japan fits very much in line with that. If I may, this isn't even a thing that we talked about discussing, but just to note that Chile in the last couple of days has made a major transition in its government. I'm really excited by it, and not enough people recognize this is also why we have to get our nation's intelligence agencies on a leash, because any left-wing government in the world is at risk as long as the CIA enjoys impunity for whatever the hell it wants to do. And I see very much the need for us to restrain the agency as an act of international solidarity. Intersecting climate justice, there's no path to climate justice that allows the CIA to continue toppling democracies at the drop of a hat. But whether it's in this context of Rahm Emanuel being appointed or the need to protect the new government from Chile from our military industrial policing slavery complex, I see all that as one piece, from the Pentagon to police to prisons. These are mechanisms of social control and mechanized misery that we also have to feel ashamed of, because this stuff doesn't proceed without our active consent, right? We don't have to send these people to Washington. or to your city councils, we can make better choices as people. And I dare say we have to, for the sake of the future, if not the present.
And that brings me into Joe Biden, because this just came out. Joe Biden approval hits historic low, new poll says. So here we go. President Joe Biden's approval rating has hit a new low as he wraps up his first year in office, according to a new poll. Just 41% of Americans say they approve of the job Joe Biden is doing as president, according to an NPR/PBS NewsHour Marist poll released Monday, the lowest the pollsters have recorded during his presidency. And here is that poll makeup. Approval of the president is unsurprisingly low among Republicans at 5%, but even among independents, and this is what I was telling you guys a couple months ago when he first started to decrease, it was independents in Arizona that helped him win Arizona. So he's losing support amongst independents. It's now just 29% of independents that approve of his job. 88% of Democrats approve. The overall results are down slightly from a poll released on December 9th and stand 10 percentage points lower than when Biden first took office in January. Shaheed, I want to get your take on this, because especially with what just happened yesterday with the Build Back Better Act, the press conference that he had today, I'm going to show a clip from that in a second, but I want to get your take on this, because it just, Joe Biden is not, I said this before, Joe Biden should have never been president.
You nailed it. He put Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, so no progressive should be excited about him. There have been moments in his presidency which I have been frankly grateful for, like when he ended the 20-year war in Afghanistan, or when he appointed Lena Khan to the chairmanship of the Federal Trade Commission, where she's poised to do better work as an antitrust enforcer than anybody who's been in that position in a generation. So there have been moments, but I frankly don't even give Biden credit for any of that, because I think it was his concessions to the not me, us movement that was behind Bernie and left-wing voices in the race that frankly forced him into it. This will take a minute, but when Bernie dropped out of the race, a lot of people perceived that as a concession. I frankly did too, but the counterpoint, which some people have made, is that the voices that were encouraging him to drop out included people on his staff, people who might have said something like, if it's not me, us, then drop out of the race to give us chances in the administration and the bureaucracy. Now, when I heard not me, us, I didn't think not Bernie, his staff. I thought not politicians, we the people, right? But I think some people on his staff thought of the us as them. And some of those people are in the inside, and they seem to have some influence. So at the margin, there are things that are happening through the institutions that his movement ultimately is influencing and informing. Those are the bright spots, though. The general arc of this administration has been continuity, right? If anything, it's been steps backward, even from the last one. At the border, the practices are the same. You know, the Biden administration is defending Title 42. They're still detaining immigrants en masse, which we lack the legal authority to do. We're still separating kids from parents. I'm grateful that we're not forcibly sterilizing anyone anymore. That's not a lot to be thankful for. I mean, it's something, I guess. And then we look in the context of the stimulus payments. How is it that under the Trump administration, people got more direct support from the government than under Biden? That is not only shameful, it is a recipe for electoral disaster. And it's a fair critique. I'm not surprised that only 29% of independents support him, because he's failed just about everybody. And I would like to see there, though, I want to come back at this from a different direction. It would have been about 4 months ago now when the withdrawal from Afghanistan was happening. Until that point, Biden had a very rosy relationship with the Washington press. I think they recognized, okay, this guy is way better than the mendacious, I don't even want to name him, but just the criminal president who was here before. I think a lot of press figures were relieved to be met with some modicum of rationality. And it was interesting to me that the thing that ended that phase, the thing that brought the press out against Biden, predictably, was his stance for a moment against the military industrial complex that he had spent 50 years supporting as the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So when he comes out to end the war in Afghanistan, that's the point at which his poll number starts to tank. And they particularly start to tank because mainstream press starts demagoguing him as supposedly being, deferring to the Taliban, when ultimately what the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a recognition of the impossibility of waging a armed ground conflict on the other end of the earth in hostile terrain that we don't understand among people who are very committed to defending their territory. And that's a lesson we should have learned in Vietnam 50 years ago. And apparently we didn't. So we had to learn it again. And so Biden leaving Afghanistan, that's all that was. It was the same thing that forced us out of Vietnam. It was the limits of the military industrial complex's power and influence. And he got blamed for it by the military industrial press establishment. And so when we look at these poll numbers, as much as I frankly think they are deserved, because I don't think he's in any way a progressive president or administration, I also recognize that these numbers are driven by press promoting the interests of the very same corrupt industrial complexes that we started out talking about in the context of Pelosi a little while ago, right? So I have a hard time looking at responses to Biden as if they were in fact legitimate, because I recognize that the press is also leaning on the scale here. And I frankly wish that there would be more meaningful grappling with policy, because if people really grappled with policy, I'd like to see us respond to the Omicron variant and the public health disaster that the pandemic represents by some actual changes that he has been unwilling to make. I'm grateful for the concession of the need to distribute tests. We need to get beyond that. We should have a universal paid sick leave, universal family leave, universal health care. None of that should be controversial. There's a freaking pandemic going on, for God's sake. It's so obvious. It's painful, right? And the fact that he hasn't shown up for any of that, to me, is a symbol of the continuing failure of Washington across both of the major corporate political parties.
Shout out to Steve for the super chat. Says, I believe Tara Reid. I hear you, Steve. I hear you. I'm right there with you. Blue Moon has a good point. Why don't people do a third party coalition with all third parties? It's not about seeing one third party emerge. That's a good point.
So super thoughtful suggestion of what are described in the political science literature as fusion candidacies. And ultimately, this is something, if Pelosi does retire and I face a legion of Democrats, I will attempt to do exactly that. I'm going to be seeking endorsements from the Greens, the Working Families, the People's Party, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, right? That's exactly what we will do. And I think the other way to look at this is that the largest bloc in American politics are independents.
Yep.
Except the hole in the bucket is they're not a bloc, right? So it's just people who don't like other of the two main tents. And so if we do appeal to a widely shared sensibility, like one that would favor universal health care during a pandemic, one that would favor climate justice during this age of climate catastrophe, one that would favor peace and justice in the face of this military industrial complex run amok, I do have some hope that people outside the party apparatuses might support a challenge to one of them. And that's exactly the play that we're running.
Curtis has a good point. He said, honestly, I blame the people of America for this for this shit. People in Europe would burn shit down when they are under attack by politicians. Americans just tweet and watch Netflix.
We are organizing an action next week to call Pelosi out for her insider trading, for what it's worth. So we're doing a little more than tweeting and watching Netflix. But he's right. I mean, this is a country that's so demobilized. And I want to make this sharp, too, because I blame the left for this as much as I do people who don't pay attention. People who don't pay attention are subjected to ignorance, right? They have a thing that they have to fight through. And then many people understand what's happening, but they're apathetic. Many people recognize what's happening, they care, and then they either resign themselves in the face of this Leviathan, or they choose to fight it. And, I think a lot about Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where he bemoans not the intransigence of our right-wing enemies, but the absence of our so-called friends. Every person who shares concerns about the establishment, who is inclined to throw a tomato at the television or a shoe at a president, to throw the bums out and then sits on their hands and does nothing to advance it, that is the problem, right? It's not Trump and Biden and Pelosi. Yes, Trump and Biden and Pelosi, they're all problems, but they are not at fault. At fault are we, the people who allow them to be there. And to people who see through the ruse, people who get it enough that they could at least volunteer or contribute or be a part of campaigns to challenge them, who choose not to because they don't see the hope in it. It pains me to my soul. That is the resignation that is as dangerous to the future as fascism. It's the conciliation, it's the deference to a system that people, not everything's fun and games. And I know that there was a point in time recently when a lot of people were inspired to politics out of hope. It wasn't hope that drove me to politics. It was a profound sense of intergenerational planetary crisis. And it's only grown more acute in the time since. And I wish that the people who were drawn to politics through hope might maintain some of it as the crisis grows deeper, and alternatively recognize as the crisis grows deeper that beyond hope, we have to show up, even if we recognize that the deck is stacked, because it's in those spaces where profound transformative things can happen. We've seen them before. There was a question before that asked for receipts, examples. There are a million of them. Women gaining suffrage was one of them. The civil rights era it demonstrates both parts of the thesis, both that things can happen, also that movements can be counteracted and neutralized. The abolition of slavery, the establishment of the voting right, of the voting franchise in the first place. There have been any number of points, the ending of the Vietnam War, there have been any number of points where exposing COINTELPRO, where we have actually held power accountable as a people. And it doesn't frankly take that much. It honestly doesn't. The theories of the civil rights movement have suggested that no more than 5% of America was engaged, and it shifted the nation's history, right? You don't need everybody. We just need the people who care and get it. And I see so many people who care and get it throwing their hands up in the air and walking away, I guess, going to watch Netflix because they think there's nothing they can do about it. And that is exactly what we cannot afford at this particular moment. As a people, it's the nail in the coffin.
But I think that, like, those examples, like, those are, really great examples, but those weren't done through electoral politics. I think that's the thing. Like, I don't think the civil rights movement would have worked if it was done through an election, if it was done through a campaign. Same thing with the women's movement. And I think that's the thing, is like Bernie Sanders was trying to create a movement, and he had the name recognition at that time to, really go forward with that. But he did it through a campaign. So when he suspended his campaign, the movement kind of just went out the window. We have no one leading this. And so we're kind of scattered. Some of us are divided. People are kind of doing their own thing. And it's just, he just left his movement behind. Like, he just said, okay, I'm going to go, work with Joe Biden. He went on to Crystal and Kyle and said he thought Joe Biden was doing a good job.
Yeah, that was
so it just, at the end of the day, he was beholden to the Democratic Party.
I mean, he also said Pelosi was doing a fine job in the House. So I'm not without my disappointments in him. But I also recognize that he's been doing the work for 50 years. That I wasn't, right? I mean, I got here 20 years ago, so he has 30 years on me and 50 years on most of his critics. So like I have some measure of hesitation to criticize him in particular. As we look at this point about the movement-wide dynamic, I don't think that was Bernie's movement. That was the Occupy movement that Bernie put a face on, and the movement rallied around him. And when the standard bearer put down the flag, we can't blame him. It's the movement's fault for falling apart, right? I mean, ideally, if we were as organized as I would wish, the goal there is you keep struggling for the target. If we are focused on policy, it shouldn't matter whether Bernie's on the field or not. Why has the advocacy for Medicare for all, for instance, gone so relatively quiet in the last year? Because so many people in Washington were only interested in it as an electoral ruse instead of as a policy to which they are committed. That's why I marched in July. That's why I went to Pelosi's house a month ago. It's why I'm still committed to Medicare for all, because it is the policy that matters. And we cannot water down our policy commitments for the sake of political actors. And that's, I think, ultimately what you're sort of drawing out there is the willingness of political actors to conciliate. And that's exactly what I'm saying we can't afford to allow to happen at this moment. And we, the people, have a role to play here to hold our voices accountable to our principles and to replace the voices who are not accountable to our principles with those who are.
I want to address this really quick. Curtis said not a single network is willing to take that money and build a huge movement. You're actually incorrect on that, Curtis, because actually over at Revolutionary Blackout Network, which I am a part of, we actually do mutual aid and direct action. Rome does a tour for the poor going all across this country. So I don't know if you're new here or not, but I do want to point that out to you. All of us are not the same. I have a full-time job. So not the one.
I want to give you props and your colleagues props, because I also, I remember when there was heat that you all were taking from some corners for organizing the General Strike Summit. And my response to the others, well, then what are you doing? right? I mean, you all are stepping so far beyond your roles as podcasters. You're organizing. You're on the ground in your respective places. I know Effendi doesn't have the same role in the network now, but the work she was doing in DC, like you guys are, there are a lot of voices playing above the rim in our respective spaces. And I see a lot of people blaming the squad and then throwing the rest of us down the stairs because of their disappointment and their visible standard bearers. I think that comment was, with all due respect to the person who made it, it's unfair to you, others. I know plenty of people in the independent media ecosystem who are showing up. Jordan Sheridan and Status Quo, it comes to mind, like there are so many people who are showing up. And I do think it's unfair to those of us who show up to make broad critiques of systems as if some of us were not there, right? Because frankly, you need support to do your work. They need support to do their work. We need support to do our work. If people write off entire arenas because of their disappointment in the corporate alternatives, and they don't recognize the alternatives that the independent voices offer, it's a problem for all of us.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, we got a lot of heat for the General Strike Summit from people who I didn't even knew we existed. That was really weird to have people like TYT, like commentators to like come. I'm like, do you know I'm a thing? It was just weird to me. I'm like, dude, like, don't. You have like millions of subscribers. Why are you crapping down on someone who has a small channel? I don't have
Mad
time
props
for
to
that.
you all for the initiative. I thought it was so important. So important.
That video I have to show you guys because there was a press conference by Joe Biden today. I do have a clip of that. You got to help me out here, guys, because I'm not sure what is happening here. I don't know why he made this comment again. I feel like it's saying the quiet part out loud. But this was from the press conference earlier today. Joe Biden was asked about Joe Manchin and the Build Back Better Act. And here's what he had to say. I'm going to mute my mic for just a second.
Cost. What's inflation? Having to pay more than the money you have because things have gone up. Well, bring down all those costs across the board, from child care to a child care tax credit. But I'm not supposed to be having this press conference.
Mr. President, did Senator Manchin break his commitment to you? When you announced the framework, the White House says that all 50 senators were believed to get behind it, all 50 Democratic senators. So did Senator Manchin break his commitment to you?
Senator Manchin and I are going to get something done. Thank you.
Sir, do you still have the card with the desk?
The volume's a little low on that video, but basically what he said was he's not supposed to be doing this press conference. I don't know why that why he said that to everyone. And then they asked about Joe Manchin, and he said, Manchin and I are gonna get things done. And then he just walked off.
That's our democracy for you, and what is he going to get done? Anything useful? Probably not. There's when the Senate was considering the Build Back Better bill before Manchin recently announced that all of his posturing was in bad faith, one of the questions that were before the Senate was what to do with the SALT cap repeal, the provision that we talked about passing the House that would be a tax break for millionaires. The Senate was talking about possibly rejiggering that so that the SALT cap repeal would not be just a regressive benefit to the ultra wealthy. And then, of course, the bill stalled, and here we are. So if I expect that whatever Biden and Manchin might ultimately get done will likely not include any limits on the self-enrichment of the millionaire Congress people who drove this process forward.
Oh boy. Oh boy. Thanks so much, Zayden, for the super chat. Does Buttar think capitalism can be reformed like the Democrats and Republicans tell us, or should it be totally replaced with socialism? Good question, Zayden. Thanks so much.
It is a good question, and I dare say that it might run the risk of mistaking what capitalism and socialism are. There's not a flip that we switch that shifts us from one to the other. It's like any system, like I was saying before, we replace pieces. So like we could replace one piece, the for-profit healthcare system. We could replace it with a system where if you need to see a doctor or you need a surgery or if you need medicine, you get it free at the point of cost and the government through our collective resources pays for it. That's an example of socialism. But even when we get Medicare for all, that doesn't make us now a socialist country because we still have for-profit everything else, right? I would like to nationalize the fossil fuel industry so that energy is socialized, and that that way we can also make democratic decisions about what we want to do about energy. Maybe we want to ramp down some sectors like fossil fuels instead of allowing economics to encourage private industry to squeeze every last drop of blood out of the earth, the oil. I mean, I'm thinking of this through the context of fracking, which is a perfect example of what happens when we take all the oil we can get. The economic incentives are still there. Well, let's start engineering new ways to squeeze out every last drop. And that's the inevitable result unless we nationalize the industry. I would like to nationalize the pharmaceutical industry. Each of these are examples of stepping towards socialism. But in terms of getting there, every one of those fights is, how hard these are, right? So I don't see flipping the switch to socialism as a thing that we're going to be able to do anytime soon. I would like to get us as far down that road as possible.
The Traveler said Biden, was the rotating villain for Clinton with student debt, Lieberman with Obama with the public option, and now it's Manchin.
Huge. Biden was brought into the Obama administration to give capitalists comfort that Obama was safe. That was his role. He's been a cheerleader for every war in the last generation. It was Biden who put Clarence Thomas on the bench and ensured that 43 million Americans wouldn't be able to seek bankruptcy protection for our student loans. That's Biden.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Yeah, I do want to remind people of that. He is the reason why you can't declare like your student loans for bankruptcy is because of Joe Biden. So he's the reason why we're stuck. And that's why I put so much pressure that like he needs to cancel student loan debt, because he's the reason why you just can't write it off. You can't. So.
And he doesn't need Manchin for it. That's the key. There's no rotating villain for him to blame for that. Right?
No.
It's worth noting that Nancy Pelosi opposes student debt cancellation, and she took that position after meeting with some billionaire donors. But I digress. I absolutely agree that the president he must cancel student debt, not just as a matter for economic equity, but simply as economic stimulus. If we try to force people to go back into student debt repayment at this moment in economic history, it's going to crash the economy. And it's senseless.
It's terrible. Like, I just can't, I don't understand how everybody's just magically going to have to snap back into it like that. I received an email that said, get ready. I was like, really? As if this was like some type of, I don't know, present or something.
Woo, yeah.
Get ready. I want to shout out these comments from Roger Meadows on Rockfin. Thanks so much for the tips, Roger. He said, the pyramid imagined as a tree. The soil is the Federal Reserve Bank, the Wall Street banks, and the corporations. Imagine, if you will, the soil is corrupted. No matter what tree you plant there, it will be an ill-nourished tree. We must change the soil. Dismantling the system piece by piece means replacing the Federal Reserve Bank with Illinois Congressman Danny Davis' proposal for a national infrastructure bank, aka National Public Bank, but a network of pub banks throughout the country at every level of government. 2, we replace corporations with worker co-ops. Those two things will be us changing the soil, true groundswell. 3, knowing that, Shaheed, why would you advocate for starting at the tree, aka Congress? Congress. You would be going into a tree with bad soil. Any change you want to see must come from the states, especially via ballot initiative. California is a state that allows voters to go completely around California government to place initiatives directly on the ballot to pass California law and allow voters to amend the California Constitution. Anything you want to see done nationally, you can do it at the state level. Then watch proliferate in other ballot initiative states. Then eventually state legislatures in states that don't allow voters to do this will get the picture. Then eventually federal, CIA overthrowing Latin American governments for taking a socialist communist approach to government as they nationalize resources and essential services. Expand public banks with the proliferation of worker co-ops while getting off Petro is because they're trying to advance American corporate Wall Street interests, who gets beat every time against eminent domain, public banks, and worker co-ops and the CIA won't be a problem. That was deep, Roger.
There was a lot to respond to there. That was deep. I kind of want to see that so I can like grip it all.
Let me see if it'll let me. Eric, I'm going to try it. Eric's in the background. Eric, I don't know if this looks okay. I don't know if there's a way to just share because the chat's like over here.
I see.
Sorry.
I mean, parts of it I certainly remember enough to comment on. The public banking invitation is super right on. Public banking is a really critical example of socialism, right? And when we talked about stepping towards socialism, that's one sector we're making what effective public bank would represent a public option. The same role that a public option would have as a health insurance policy is the same role that a public bank represents relative to corporate banks. I was part of National Bank Transfer Day. This was an action we did during the Occupy movement to encourage people to move assets out of corporate banks into particularly credit unions. So while we're seeking public banks, do that. Take your money out of a corporate bank, put it in a credit union. That's at least one step there. To the point about, why would you deal with the tree if you think the ground is polluted? Two thoughts there. One, when we're talking about public policy, you can't actually fix the soil first. The only way to fix the soil is through the tree within this metaphor. Another way I'd lay this out here is just simply my history. I've fought for marriage equality and we won it. I've fought for limits on the surveillance state and we've won those too. Not nearly enough and at not nearly the levels that I would like. But in a dozen cities around the country, we've put in place restraints to keep police departments from being able to get military spy gear without civilian oversight. I've seen victories happen in the context of this soil that people think is so polluted that we can make nothing happen. Again, this goes back to my point about a lot of people watching a thing and throwing their hands up in the air instead of grappling with it. And to everybody who thinks that there's no hope in politics, I would just invite you to look at the history because there are any number of demonstrations to the contrary. If we think there is no hope, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy and there will be none. The future cannot afford our hopelessness is the simple way I would put that.
Yeah. I think that people, in reference to the hope issue, I think people just are losing hope in the two-party system. I think people are looking for other avenues and other options. So Josana, she's my comrade over at RBN. She's from Brazil. I've learned so much from her. She has been, explaining to me, like, she said, we don't really fight here in this country like they do in Brazil. And she was saying how, like, in Brazil, like, they rose up, like they hit the streets and the people really like fought back and demanded like some type of, respect and change. And she said, America, we tend to respond to things through a capitalist lens. So we were talking about the strikes, right? There's a lot of like strikes going on, worker strikes, which I believe should happen. But she was saying that's still the capitalist response because you're still playing into it. She said the people have to actually get out in the streets and they have to demand it, kind of like the way we did after George Floyd.
It's a piece of it. Grassroots mobilization, how do I put this? It's easily co-opted, but it can force instability. It can break inertia in ways that create opportunities for institutional actors. That's how the Justice and Policing Act passed the House. I was Pelosi's first Democratic challenger ever. I backed that bill, and with a loud movement in the streets, she felt compelled to as well. And then it passed the House. It's a fairly like tight arc. It's not even that complicated. It's hard as hell to execute, right? Because it takes a lot of people. And I would like to see us motivated not merely by rage in response to our brothers and sisters being killed in the street, but also by, to get back to the hope question, some hope in a livable future that we might still recover if we all lean in and do something about it. I think you're absolutely right that people are disillusioned with the two-party system. And like any system, like I said before, we can't replace it at once. We have to replace it in pieces. And that requires patience. It requires insight to recognize which pieces we need to flip and fix. And it takes a lot of work, but I'm certainly here for it. I get the sense that many of your listeners are too, and I'm grateful for all their work.
Shout out to Pitchforks to come in for becoming a Sabby member. Thanks so much.
Can I shout out one of your commenters? I think it was Brandy a minute ago. You flashed it on the screen where she was saying, I think that Arkansas is a ballot initiative state and they won some really, I didn't get to read the whole thing. It looked like there might've been some examples of policies that they'd won in Arkansas. through that process. And I just want to, like, throw my hands up in the air and praise that kind of work. That's exactly what, yeah. This one, medical marijuana and a minimum wage increase. Great. That's a perfect example of how grassroots initiative, where the process is available, can hold institutions accountable. Arkansas and California are, very different. In California, the way the ballot propositions work is they're basically vehicles for corporate proposals, and left-wing proposals get pretty routinely outfunded. We actually lost marriage equality through this process at one point before we got it back. So it can be fraught. But it's one among the many pathways to social change. And just to lay these out there's ballot initiatives, there's policy advocacy, public education, direct action, mutual aid, electoral work. All of it has to happen. And all of it offers opportunities, especially when it's all moving in concert. That's when things can really change. When all of those levers are being pulled, when we're active when we're in the streets, when we're in the boardrooms, when we're in the elections, when we're on the phones, when our movement is ubiquitous across those various spheres, that's when we win.
I live also in a ballot initiative state in Massachusetts. That's actually how we legalized marijuana here. That was a ballot initiative. Same thing with what did we just do recently? Oh, ranked choice voting. That one didn't pass though.
Did not? I'm sorry to hear that. Okay.
I don't think, for most people I talked to, they didn't understand the question. But I was also told sometimes that's done on purpose.
It usually often is.
Yeah. It's worded in a way where people are like, what does this even mean? So unfortunately that one didn't pass, but that is how we legalized marijuana here in Massachusetts. So it can work. It can help out a lot. Shaheed, I think you're a cool dude.
Thank you, Sabby.
You're one of the few, I would say, like, candidates that I feel comfortable saying that to. You're more like chill. But I think you're a cool dude. Like me personally, I personally have had it with the two-party system. If I do vote, I'm going to do so through third party, just because I look back on how Ross Perot was able to disrupt things, like running as a third party candidate. And no, he didn't win, but he was able to take enough votes away to create a difference. So that's kind of where I'm focusing on, that and like direct action and mutual aid. But you're always welcome here.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Those are great focuses and I applaud them, and I'm grateful for the chance to reconnect. Keep up the great work.
All right, cool. All right, guys, you know how we do this. Have a good night. Keep up the fight.